Okay. Hello, everyone. Um, Yoko, Jonathan, and Rachel, that was super interesting. Thank you very much for sharing your research and all those good sources. My name is indeed Sandra Elgersma, and I'm from the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees office here in Ottawa. I'm really happy to be with you here today, and so thank you for the invitation. Um, our research is quite different, as you will see. I'll be speaking to this publication, Are Refugees Good for Canada? A look at Canadian refugee integration. But just as importantly, I'm going to tell you the story behind this publication and why we put it out there and what we're hoping to achieve with it. I'd like to acknowledge at the outset the support of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada and Statistics Canada, because this is really their data. What UNHCR has done is pulled out the focus on refugees and tried to package the information in a way that makes data easily accessible to people. And I'm going to talk about essentially these 5 things. What is UNHCR? Why did we do this study? What are some of the findings? And then I wanted to talk about COVID-19 and the impacts that we see and anticipate, and then some next steps. So about the UNHCR. UNHCR was created by the United Nations in 1950. So that means last year we were commemorating our 70th anniversary. And the High Commissioner of Refugees, he likes to put it that we're proud of our work, but in no mood to celebrate. And so the fact that there has been 70 years of refugee displacement and that in fact it's increasing is not really something that one would celebrate in a traditional birthday kind of way. UNHCR works in more than 130 countries. Our mandate is to provide international protection to refugees and seek permanent solutions. So we do that work in a humanitarian, non-political fashion, working in cooperation with governments, NGOs, civil society, the media, and so on. So why this study? The UNHCR, in short, wants to shore up public support for refugees. And that means in part supplying allies and partners with credible data. It also means countering negative narratives. And we want to shore up this public support both globally and in Canada. As I alluded to earlier, we're in a context of unprecedented levels of displacement. Forced displacement is now affecting more than 1% of humanity, or 1 in every 97 people. And fewer of those who flee are able to return home, which means that other solutions are increasingly important. And this was the reality before COVID even hit. So the needs are only amplified now. In response to this sort of global context, the United Nations affirmed the Global Compact on Refugees in 2018. In doing so, the global community recognized that the challenges of displacement need to be addressed together and with the involvement of all sectors. And the Global Compact on Refugees envisioned the development of a 3-year strategy on resettlement and complementary pathways, which has since been developed through a multi-stakeholder process. And the strategy has 3 goals, which you can see here on my slide. One is to grow resettlement. So to grow the number of countries that offer resettlement and the spots put forward by resettlement states. Secondly, to advance complementary pathways, which are safe and regulated avenues for refugees that complement resettlement by providing a lawful stay in a third country where their international protection needs are met. And this is the relevance now to my topic for today. The third goal is building the foundation, promoting welcoming and inclusive societies. And very importantly, it's recognized in this strategy that the expansion of solution spaces, things like resettlement and complementary pathways, is only going to be sustained if it's supported by local communities. So we need to shore up that support for refugees among local authorities, cities, municipalities, and citizens, and this work that they're doing to welcome and support refugees. Now, in the Canadian context, well, most Canadians continue to believe that immigration has a positive impact on the country's economy and brings greater cultural diversity in Canada. There are pockets of people who believe that there are too many refugees and asylum seekers, that immigrants need to do more to integrate into Canada, and that immigration has placed too much pressure on public services. And specifically, one of our motivations for producing this research, which I promise I will get to, was polling carried out at the time that showed that among those who were opposed to refugees coming to Canada, the perception that refugees pose an economic burden we can't afford was very high. And we wanted to tackle that cost question directly. We wanted to show the important contributions refugees make to their communities, as well as to Canada's economy and cultural diversity. So through this publication, we wanted to provide facts and make information easily available. And in fact, since it's come out, it does show up in some surprising places. It's picked up by reporters and other people who like to have short data available on hand that they can include in a story or to support a point they're making. We also wanted to be able to counter a negative narrative, and this slide here shows just an example of how UNHCR has used on Twitter some of the facts in the report. So I'll move on now to the actual findings, or the findings we chose to highlight in the report. First, on employment and income. As you can see here, and most of this data comes from this 2016 census, a couple of other sources as well, as noted in the report itself. But in 2016, the working age refugees had an unemployment rate only slightly higher than that for the Canadian born. And most importantly, as it's noted there and highlighted in yellow, refugees' unemployment rate improves with time spent in Canada. Here we see that, here we're talking about employment and income again, and refugees who arrived as adults earn on average $20,000 in employment income in their first year, which is less than half the Canadian average earnings. But we see here that the income distribution pattern for refugees who had been in Canada for 5 years or more looked fairly similar to that for all immigrants in the Canadian born. And again, I think an important key message is that annual earnings climb steadily. This slide shows the breakdown of skill levels of refugees that are working, or that were working at the time of the census collection. And it shows that a significant proportion are working in jobs that require post-secondary education or apprenticeship training. And it's really important to emphasize that there are skilled people among the refugee population, even though, as pointed out in the previous presentation, refugees who are resettled to Canada are not selected on that basis. Also relevant to work experience, our publication highlights that refugees start businesses and create jobs for themselves and other Canadians. 14.4% of those who've been in Canada between 10 and 30 years are entrepreneurs. Now this ties in quite nicely to the previous presentation. Refugees also contribute to Canada's demographic makeup. Canada has an aging population and needs more young people. Refugees are on average 11.1 years younger than those born in Canada, with an average age of 28.9 in 2016. And as you can see on the map, many refugees settle in smaller Canadian cities and towns, not just in major urban areas. And in fact, as we just heard, some of these areas like Nova Scotia or small northern and rural communities are trying to rejuvenate their communities with new populations and are eagerly seeking out immigrants, refugees included. In the area of belonging, we wanted to look at that as well. One aspect to consider is homeownership, which is an indicator not only of a household's financial health, but also of a family's commitment to a community. And despite their initial lack of financial resources, 65% of refugee families who've been in Canada for 10 years or more live in homes they own. And about a third of refugee families manage to buy their own homes within the first 5 years in the country. Refugees report a strong sense of belonging to Canada, 95% of respondents rating their sense of belonging as high. And on the rate of citizenship, another important aspect of belonging, the rate of citizenship uptake is highest for refugees out of all immigration categories. 88% of refugees become citizens, compared to 80% of family class immigrants and 84% of economic class immigrants. And these findings were affirmed again in the most recent evaluation of IRCC's citizenship program, published not that long ago. Talking now about the next generation. The key message here is that refugee children perform as well in school as Canadian-born children. In fact, if you look closely at this graph, refugees who arrived in Canada as children have a higher completion rate of high school, college, university, and graduate degrees than the Canadian-born. Now, in terms of COVID, globally, when we think about refugees globally, COVID-19 is exacerbating challenges and vulnerabilities that refugees face around the world. The displaced are among the most vulnerable to the health threat and also to the consequent socioeconomic impact of the virus. And Canada has continued with resettlement, particularly emergency resettlement cases and some private sponsorship. But anecdotally, we know that it's been a challenging time for new arrivals, especially to integrate economically and socially. They're facing isolation and quarantine, and a lot of programs are being delivered online, which has been an amazing pivot, but it's also difficult sometimes for people to access and fully take advantage of those opportunities. So we can anticipate that the next time the census is taken or the next time this data is collected, we'll see that some of the outcomes might not be as positive. They might be, what we're concerned anyway, that some of the data will show a scarring effect, or will show that there was a delay in getting going on that long-term success. We also know that the pandemic has been hard on established immigrants, and that immigrants and racialized people in particular have experienced job losses and work in environments at greater risk to getting COVID. And so, we're still not at the point of knowing the long-term effects in terms of data on these differences in the workplace. But there's also been a flip side or another aspect, I guess, to the impact of COVID. And that is that there's been a lot of media attention around refugees and their contributions to Canadian society. There's been, a lot of stories about their contribution as essential workers. The government introduced a special program for healthcare workers, but we also know that refugees are on the front lines in many other ways. Just over the weekend, there was a story of a young Syrian refugee, those of you in Ontario might have read about it, who worked in a long-term care home as a cleaner, who unfortunately got COVID and succumbed to it. But there have been these kinds of stories highlighting contributions in so many parts of Canada. And also not just in terms of the workplace, but in other ways as well, making masks, running errands for neighbors, and all kinds of different types of contributions have been highlighted. So for UNHCR, we're thinking about next steps in terms of the publication that I briefly shared with you. We know that stories communicate in a way that numbers don't. So we're focusing on collecting and promoting stories that illustrate these statistics from around the country. It makes a different impact if you're learning about, the entrepreneur that started a business in your community and is making a difference right down the street from you, rather than reading about a national statistic. In light of the COVID impacts, we want to emphasize common challenges facing refugees and other Canadians and the contributions that refugees bring. And I think back to the big picture again, COVID has severely tested refugee protection and inclusion, making it more important than ever to maintain the warmth of the welcome in Canada, which is ultimately what we're trying to support with the publication that we put out, and of which I was speaking.